All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, the author series. In this series, I interview today's top authors in the mental health field, and we explore and do a deep dive into the books that can improve and inspire your work and your practice. Today, I'm very excited to have as my guest, Tim Gordon. Tim, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just have to tell folks who are watching or listening, I am hugely geeking out right now because I'm a big fan of the Trauma Therapist 2.0 work. I'm a big fan of yours, Guy. So this is really cool for me to be a part of this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for saying that. So Tim is a social worker and peer-reviewed acceptance and commitment therapy trainer, or ACT. Tim specializes in treating attachment and trauma-related disorders, and he's also a yoga teacher who integrates movement and yoga practices into his treatment. Tim is a co-author of ACT Approach, a book that won the 2018 Benjamin Franklin Gold Seal for Psychology. He's also co-authored the ACT Deck, 55 brief practices on using acceptance and commitment therapy in practice. And most recently, Tim's authored the Coping Skills Deck for Trauma, a collection of brief practices to encourage self-care, acceptance, and positive affirmations in the face of recovering from trauma. Awesome. All right. Yeah. This is the book.
The ACT Approach.
But I want to tell you something. About a month, this is kind of weird, and this is kind of referring back to what we were kind of started talking about before we were recording. About a month ago, I sat down with a couple friends of mine, and I was in this kind of dilemma, like, oh my gosh, what should I do? I don't know. And one of my former colleagues, she said, dude, have you heard of ACT? You've got it. This is like perfect. And she showed me something. I had heard of it before, but she showed me this thing, and I'm like, this makes total sense. Anyway, so I say that as kind of an introduction, but anyway.
That's really cool, Guy.
Yeah, it was kind of synchronicity right there. So anyway, I say that I'm very excited to have you on here and to talk about this stuff.
I had a similar journey, like, you know, a lot of the folks in the ACT community, and I say this with love, I say this with respect. I think it's easy to take ACT and its underpinning of radical behavioral science for granted because they came up, they were raised in that world. Mm-hmm. That's not my world. I came to ACT after having already developed a repertoire of skills as a trauma therapist. And when I discovered ACT, I had been feeling a little bit desperate. And I found this thing that just clicked. Like all the pieces worked, and I was like, booyah, like this is what as a sort of workshop junkie, like this is what I was looking for. And it was hard to pick it up from there because at the time there weren't a lot of resources that made ACT very, let's say, palatable.
Well, I think that's a good jumping off point. I mean, for those listeners who might not be familiar with it, why did it make sense to you? Why did it jump out to you?
The first thing, like, and I don't mean to be cheesy in any way whatsoever. I want to start with acceptance, like the first letter in the acronym ACT, A-C-T, right? This idea of acceptance as an alternative to control. So one of the things that I found myself personally, like as a young white guy trying to help people who are in these really dark places in their lives, who are marginalized, who are facing systemic oppression, I found that the models that I was being trained in had this very sort of white knight, almost patriarchal approach, very much like, okay, I'm going to come in, I have this treatment that I'm going to do to you. Mm-hmm. And as this healing provider, I'm going to do this real good work, and this is going to be the outcome. Like, here's our metric of success. This position of saying, you're suffering, you're in a dark place, and I can learn how to be here with you. I can learn how to sit with it. I can learn how to see what you see. And maybe if we could sit with that darkness, what possibly could grow from it? Like no longer needing to defend against it and fight it, but like what could grow from that position? And man, like that came into my life in a place where it really touched my heart personally in a meaningful way. And I felt like it delivered on like that famous Carl Rogers quote that I adore and still adore to this day. Like, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, that's when I'm able to change. So acceptance as an alternative to control. We need not make the darkness go away. You need not live without symptoms. You need not, if you're experiencing schizoaffective symptoms, if you're experiencing auditory hallucinations, let's learn how to roll with it.
Right.
If you have negative thoughts, if you have an intrusive traumatic memory, let's learn how to hold that and move towards what's most meaningful to us. And that position alone, like Guy, I'm telling you, for the folks who are allowing me into your world, I got to tell you, I've gotten so much mileage out of just that acceptance move alone. And the feedback that I get from clients is tearfully, with gravity, they say, like, this is the first time somebody has really listened and understood that this ain't going anywhere. This is a part of my experience, that I can't just, engage in X to make me feel better, or, oh, all of a sudden the intrusive stuff doesn't make it so that being intimate with my partner, or with, dating someone new, all of a sudden isn't triggering for me. Like, they get that there's somebody showing up who's really saying, like, no, this is a scar. We need to learn how to, like, own it and wear it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I mean, you're speaking about a lot of things in a sense. One, I think initially is that whole acceptance really shifts the dynamic, right? Initially you were talking about, well, I'm coming in as this person with all this knowledge. I'm going to fix you. I have all the answers, as opposed to, and that does one thing with the relationship. I mean, it does a lot of things with the possibility of creating relationship and rapport, as opposed to what you're talking about, approaching it with this other way of accepting, of this is the way it is, with a very human-centered approach. And that's one of the things actually that I'm almost going to say surprised me. I mean, this is an evidence-based treatment, right? Here's a book on it, and
if people are listening and they didn't just see your head, Guy, your head, like, evidence-based, like, okay, here we go, right? Like,
there are, I think, some assumptions that come with these some approaches, but I was just
like manuals, Guy, like
manuals.
This is what we're gonna have to do, and
Right.
adherence. Well, oh yeah.
Right.
I have those assumptions too.
And this, for me, and this is not BS. I mean, I was going through this book, and I was excited about this acceptance. And one of the things that I loved, I was on page 26, when you're talking about noticing the difference. You're talking about the life map, and you say this is why our work is about accepting painful experiences and not waiting until we feel better to move toward who and what is important to us. It's about accepting what's going on, and learning to move with that, to dance with that, if you will. But let's I know that it's easy to just dive in here. Why did you write this book? First off, let's start with that.
At the time, I wanted to write the book, and please, I hope this comes out with the utmost humility, because I didn't know this book would be a success. I wrote the book that I needed when I was learning ACT. That's 100%. That's where I went from this. So I've been giving workshops for years. I've really finely tuned, how I give an intensive 2-day workshop to people who are new clinicians and students, as well as people who are seasoned veteran clinicians who've been out there working for and grinding it for a really long time. They're showing up just looking for, give me something that's useful. So this book really comes from a place of saying, man, I wish that this is what I had when I was learning ACT, because ACT is, we say this in the intro, it surprises people. You hear the pitch, acceptance, we may use mindfulness techniques. It sounds pretty chill. It sounds like, we have this nice, well-rounded kind of approach. And then you start learning that this is actually based on radical behavioral science, and that we only use the word acceptance to describe a very serious operationalized process that we have nailed down in mediational studies. And I know I start talking stats, Guy, and that makes, people's eyes want to roll to the back of their heads. I get it. So really what I wanted to do with the book with my co-author is we wanted to create a way of talking about ACT that would gently introduce people to the actual practice demonstrate to them that we're not going to dictate to you, here's what you do in session 1 and session 2, because that can become really attractive, by the way, right?
Mhm.
Like as somebody who gives workshops, people like worksheets, people like exercises. So Tim, give me your favorite like exercise that you like to do with clients. Well, but that sometimes might fly and it might not fly, right? And so really training them on what is the science that makes this stuff work. And that's the difficulty in writing an ACT book, because
Mhm.
ACT is not a simply linear treatment, it's process based. And so what we're doing is we're looking for, how do we create acceptance on the fly in the moment with our clients? Well, we can instigate it, but we can also model it ourselves.
Mm.
We can reinforce it, right? And we can be in a place of acceptance with our clients. We can show them from outside of that place what that might look like. So there's so much that we can do with just that acceptance based process work. So that's where the book came from, is how can we subvert clinicians into getting into this nerdy science stuff, but in a way that will feel relevant and very practical for them.
Right. And I think, genuinely, I think you guys did a good job doing that. It really gave a foundation. You talked about the science behind it, and I think it really provided a good foundation
Thanks,
for
Guy.
what was to follow.
That
So
means
how? Thank you. How would you, before we start talking about, maybe how this is utilized for those who are working within the context of trauma, how would you describe what ACT is?
yeah. So
20 seconds.
well, actually, I
Okay.
have I've got a really good pitch for you.
Okay.
And this is the heart of ACT. So what ACT is about is helping people to hold their pain so that their life isn't limited by it, so that they're no longer governed by it. And if that involves learning new ways of engaging with what matters most to them and not mortgaging their hopes and their values, cool, we'll do that. If it doesn't involve that, maybe the quality of life is just in learning how to hold what hurts. That's what is at the heart of ACT.
Awesome. Okay. So how would you like to dive in here and talk about utilizing this within the context of trauma?
Well, we've broken the book into 3 separate chunks, and so one chunk where we look at these acceptance-based processes, we call that openness, and this is an adaptation of Patricia Robinson, Kirk Strassel, and Thomas Gustafson's work, looking at creating like a 3-pillar model of ACT, if you will. So openness to pain, awareness of the moment, and engagement with what matters. So let's talk about openness, because openness is hard for folks with a trauma background. And so that first sort of chunk of the book that we have there, when we talk about openness, what we mean is acceptance, which is fully coming in contact with painful stuff. Now, for some of our clients with trauma histories, acknowledging those stories, looking at the content of those stories can be really painful. Perhaps there's some avoidance around that. Also, let's look at the flip side, because I know that you may also be thinking of clients who you start talking about some really stuck stories, some situations that they've been in, and all of a sudden the conversation that we're now having is they're really into that. Like the whole session can become rehashing this kind of experience. So we would call that fusion, right? And fusion is what happens when you heat up 2 metals and you press them together, right? They become fused with one another. So we have this term that we like to call diffusion. It's a made up term. Uh, a friend of mine who's a metallurgist, she has this really funny joke where she's like, it's actually a really clever term, Tim. She's like, she's told me this story after I'd written the book, which is lame because I wish I could have used this metaphor in the book. But she's like, as somebody who deals with metals for a living, she's like, when you heat up 2 metals on a molecular level, they exchange, they become one. And so she's like, but when you heat up metals, you can pull them apart. She's like, but molecularly, they'll never be completely separate. Like there will always be molecules from gold and the silver and silver and the gold. Anyways, I digress. So diffusion is actually a really cool term, because what we help our clients to do when acceptance is a really lofty goal is we help them to diffuse from those thoughts and from those experiences, perhaps from those sensations. We can help them take a step back and notice them. And I'm doing this thing with my hand where I'm sort of leaning away from my hand, and I'm almost imagining like my hand is like a traumatic experience that I'm having. And when I'm in that traumatic experience,
Mm-hmm.
when I'm remembering it, when I'm, let's say going back there in perspective, man, I can start having a panic attack. I can start to feel not just tightness in my chest, but this like vibrating pain coming from my abdominal area, upper abdominal area. So what we asked to do with diffusion is like, let's actually acknowledge, okay, so what are those symptoms that you're noticing? Where do you feel that in your body? Take a breath. Let's feel it on purpose. Let's pay attention to it. And if we were to go all in on it, if we weren't to be accepting of it right now, Tim, what might that have you do? And I might say to you something like, Guy, like, because I know that we're not broadcasting live, so maybe I would just be like, "Oh, Guy, I'm so sorry. I have some lower intestinal pressure. We got to cancel for today," and I just dip, right? And so, from a diffused position where we can have a little bit of distance from that, we can train people to actually notice what's going on with them and help them to not react. And that's where the acceptance piece comes from. So when we say openness to pain, we've got two unique processes that we know mediate for positive outcomes where we can actually help people. We can train our clients to use those in vivo in the session.
Mm-hmm. This idea of, not focusing on pushing away pain, trauma, troubling experiences is very interesting when you're talking about trauma. What do you mean? Are you saying that, but I want my pain to go away. I want my trauma to go away.
Yeah. Well, so let's look at that. I mean, how many of our clients have been working really hard to eliminate pain in a way that costs them? So, for example, opting out, distancing myself from relationships, abusing substances. Now, if a client is, let's say, engaging in some avoidance, they're pushing away their pain in a way that actually isn't problematic, in a way that isn't impacting their quality of life negatively, right on. That's a freebie. Go for it. That sounds pretty cool. Like, Guy, if you and I do a little meditation session here before we say goodbye, and your listeners are doing one with us, and they like, you're feeling relaxed, I'm feeling relaxed, they're feeling relaxed, and they're getting out of their car and they're getting ready to start their day at work, and they're stepping out onto the street and a Honda Civic is careening towards them at a high rate of speed. Guy, I don't want you, me, them. I don't want you accepting that. I want you to get out of the way.
Right.
Like experiential avoidance is helpful. The species that never avoids is the species that goes extinct. So when a client says to me, and I actually like it when a client says this to me, but Tim, how do I get rid of this? And I'll say, what have you tried? How have you been trying to eliminate this? And that's where we start coming up with the list of behaviors. And we use the life map. You referenced this earlier. It's just a diagram. It's a way of writing out behaviors that clients engage in as well as their experiences. So on one side of the spectrum of the life map, I might say like, I'm a big fan of Guy, so I might write that down. And then what's a behavior that I would do that would be connected with that value of me being a fan of Guy and really appreciating his work? Well, hanging out with you and doing this author series. Okay, well, what difficult stuff might actually show up to make that hard, Tim? Well, my own thoughts and feelings of inadequacy. Difficult stuff, a chronic health issue that I'm dealing with. Okay, and what might you do if that chronic health issue shows up, Tim? How might you try to avoid it or control it? Okay, now listen really carefully because we're going to talk from a functional perspective. Well, I'm just going to make sure that I fill up my water bottle. It's nice and full with some really cold water. And when I'm starting to feel like I'm kind of losing it, I'm just going to take a breath and I'm just going to notice like the color of Guy's frame of his glasses. They're really cool. And I'm noticing him smiling, and I'm just going to enjoy some cold water and just allow myself to kind of physically not feel great and just be here. Now, does that sound like a problematic escape move to you, Guy?
No.
Not at all. Okay, now hang on here. But what if I told you, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to start like getting caught up in my head and thinking about how Guy thinks I'm an idiot, how he's regretting booking this interview with me. Oh God, how his listeners must be so embarrassed. Then I start leaning away from the camera. All of a sudden, like the paint becomes really interesting, right? That might be a problematic behavior. Yeah.
Right,
And
right.
so when clients tell me like they don't want to feel something, I love that, right? They tell me they want to escape something. Yeah. Tell me about it. What have you tried? What's that look like? How's that cost you? How's that not worked? And that's where we create this accepting non-eliminative contract from, because the amount of control that we have over the experiences that we associate with trauma are pretty nil, right? We don't have the ability to control for those. So how do we learn how to roll with them? And that's where acceptance comes from. But remember, I mean, we're only talking about 1/3 of this model right now. We're just talking about the openness chunk, right? Encouraging people to be open to that. And that's how we create this non-eliminative contract.
Okay.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but those three pillars, do you use those in the deck too?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've
Okay.
divided the deck into open, aware, and engaged.
Cool.
Yeah, it just makes so much sense to me to think about the ACT model not as 6 processes, because man, that's hard to track, right? But think
Right.
about it as encouraging openness to pain, right? Encouraging awareness, what's happening here in the moment, like learning how to be here now, and engaging with our values, right? Encouraging like purposeful movement, connection with who and what matters most to us in our lives. Yeah. And that's the natural flip side to that acceptance stuff, right? Okay, great. Acceptance is awesome. What are you going to do with it? Where are you going to go?
Right. Okay. Well, let's let that unfold there. So after openness comes what? Awareness?
Awareness. Yeah. Yeah. And like we're familiar with what awareness means, right? I mean, it's in our culture now, it's seeping in, right? We know that mindfulness is good for us. What we're seeking to do, and I don't mean to be a reductionist here, but what we're seeking to do is to not simply have a certain outcome. What we want to do is train people to pay attention to what's happening here and now. That includes aversive, nasty stuff. Tim, if you're experiencing upper abdominal pain and you're noticing that vibrating out through your body, take a breath, man. Notice that, feel that. Where do you feel that in your body? Well, I feel it in my chest. Okay, where in your chest point? Oh, well, that's the third button down on your shirt. Okay, yeah, you're feeling it there. So kind of upper abdomen, lower chest area. Okay. And let's take a moment here. What exactly is it that you're experiencing? Like what kind of sensations? I don't know. It's almost like I'm getting like an electric shock. Oh man. Okay, that sounds awful. Yeah, let's take a breath. Let's notice that electric shock. Let's learn how to expand our repertoire beyond that. Like, can you notice your friend Guy's glasses? You know, and maybe it's the way that your camera's tinting your color, or maybe it's your white balance. I'm a photography nerd. So like your glasses almost look a little bit purple. It's a really cool look. It contrasts really nicely with the blue denim. I really like those glasses. All right, Tim, don't ignore your symptoms that you're feeling in your chest. Come back to those, feel those, be with those, and be with Guy. And learn how to be present with that. Now, I'm going to really go deep into this awareness piece. And notice that you are not your pain. You're not your trauma. You're not the words that you hear coming from my mouth. You know you're not the sound of my voice. And I know this gets trippy, like a little bit like, the universe is made of cream cheese, Guy. Okay, but hang on. Go with me. Just like you can hear the sound of my voice, you know you're not Tim's voice. You know that like there's an analog to digital converter in this large diaphragm microphone that's picking up on my voice and it's sending it through a USB cable. And Guy, who's on the West Coast, all those zeros and ones get transmitted to him. And he has a digital to analog converter so that he can actually hear the sound produced over his AirPods. Your listeners listening over speakers or their own headphones. You know you're not the sound of my voice. You know you're interpreting, you're hearing the sound of my voice. Maybe you're listening through an assisted listening device. You are the observer of my voice. You are the observer of your pain. You're the observer of your thoughts, of your sensations. It's the you that's always been there behind your eyes, always watching. But you are not your thoughts. You have thoughts, you notice them, but you're not them. You observe them. So when we really drill down to the heart of this awareness work, it's not just about present moment attention, similar to what we might teach with a mindfulness exercise, but it's also about seeing that you are not what you notice. You are the noticer.
And what does that do for a individual who's been sexually assaulted or experienced trauma, that creating that distance or observational perspective? What does that do?
It does a lot, man. It even for myself as a therapist who really deeply cares about my clients and feels really special to do this work, I struggle with my own feelings of like, I'm not good enough. I've never cured somebody's trauma. And yet I can notice that thought and I can like be in the room with somebody, like feeling their hurt and showing up just as a vessel to hold it. And as an idea, this might sound like a really nice idea, but what I see in my trauma clients is they can see that I'm holding that pain. And when we facilitate this transcendent sense of self, if you will, this sense of self that isn't your pain, it creates that, as Viktor Frankl would call that space between stimulus and response, a moment where they see that I don't see them as being defined by their trauma. A moment where we've created a space in our work together where they're noticing their trauma, but that's not who they are. And it's interesting to me, it's profound to me, it's changed my life to see how it changes my clients' lives, how they're no longer defined by what they've experienced, how they can notice how what they experience wants to give them rules. Like my mind wants to tell me, don't ever hug a client. Don't ever let us see a client see you cry. And I can just notice that, like, man, my mind loves to come up with those rigid rules. And I can get fused with that sense of myself. You need to be a professional, Tim. And I can then choose how I respond. I can let a client who's had a complex trauma history, who's never had a relationship with this man that's ever been safe before, I can let them like open their arms up to me and put their arms around me and hear them say, like, I really love you, Tim. And I can just like let that be in that moment, not get caught in that kind of content. Yeah.
What you're talking about here is, in one sense, written down in this book.
Yeah.
But you're talking about some pretty intense, very intense, almost spiritual things here. When you talk about connecting with someone on this level, that what's required of the therapist to do what you're talking about.
Yeah. The things that are required of the therapist are things that we know are good for us, but somehow intellectually, academically got beaten out of us. And I'm not saying like blur ethical lines. No way. No. Maintain boundaries, right? Get supervision. But what I'm talking about is not doing a model, right? Not executing a protocol. I'm talking about living acceptance in your own life, living your own openness to your own pain, your own awareness of what's happening for you in the moment, your own engagement with your values. Living act. That's where we're asking of therapists. Now we know there's data on this. So like, for the academic of your listeners who may be kind of furrowing your brow right now, I get it. Like you're welcome here too, by the way. Like that's cool. And I want to tell you, like we know that when we use ACT with healthcare providers, when we do ACT workshops with you that are experiential in nature, we know that it increases your own psychological flexibility. That's the unique measure that we use to predict and influence this stuff. So it increases your own psychological flexibility. We know that it decreases your burnout. It's almost like it inoculates you from burnout in your work, and it increases your sense of continuity, your sense of connection to your work. So what we're asking of therapists is a really tall order, because we're asking you to live this model. But I promise you, the water is warm and it's really good for you. And if there wasn't data showing that it was good for you, I wouldn't be hucking this.
Now, let me just kind of go back, and as you were going through that explanation, you seem to be having an experience, an emotional. What was going on for you, if I can ask you that?
Oh, are you kidding me, Guy? Am I going to get a free session from you? This is great.
No, I mean,
you know what was going through my mind is I'm having this thought that the work that I do means a lot to people. And I feel really special to have that role in people's lives and to be trusted in that way. And man, I think it's easy to take it for granted, right? When you got a family, you got a busy independent practice, you got supervisees who are needy, and that's not a bad thing. I like needy people. And to just have a moment here, like two people who really value this work, to just sit down and take a moment to acknowledge how important that moment was in that client's life. Like I'm pointing over here, like as if they were here. I'm in my home office, so what I was experiencing was just a really deep connection to the work, a sense of meaning, and that it touches me personally. It's really special to me. It touches on my values.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Tim.
Yeah. No, you're welcome. And I would say that, like, inside of that, like, deep sense of connection of value, like there's also like a touch of like vulnerability, right? Like there's a tender place in there. Like I can't be a fan of Trauma Therapist 2.0 and like hang out with my homeboy Guy here, and not also on the flip side of that coin have a little twinge of insecurity. Like, I'm not as cool as Dan Siegel. You know what I mean? I don't have a publication track record like Peter Levine. What am I doing? You know?
Right. So we talked about openness, awareness, and what's next here? Engagement.
Yeah. Engagement processes. So when we talk about engagement with who and what matters most, I like those words better than saying values or motivational augmentals, right? Using things to describe, like in a scientific way, because all we're talking about is what is it that's most meaningful to each person that we're dealing with. So for example, I want you to imagine for a trauma client, it might be incredibly valuable for them to have a tender, accepting relationship with you, and modeling acceptance with you in the session might actually be a move towards their values of living well, their values of opening up to a new connection. I want to be clear. Values are not goals. That's really important, right? Values are these abstract things that can sort of guide our behavior, like the light at the end of a proverbial tunnel. But the values themselves aren't a goal. So for example, like, Tim, why did you write a book? Because I really value sharing ACT in a meaningful way. That means a lot to me. So, okay, I've written a book and now I don't need to do anything else in order to do that. No way. Like, somebody that I'm a fan of, Guy, writes me and hits me up and says, hey, Tim, you want to come and talk about the book? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to do things that are in the service of spreading ACT. Guy, what does it take to be a good parent? Like, change a couple diapers, sing a song. That's it. That'll get you through 18 years worth of parenting. Am I right? No, there's more involved. What? I didn't sign up for the more involved part. Yeah. So, I mean, like, that's what we're talking about. So this sense of engagement with your values. And again, functionally, it will look different for each person. So what I love about ACT is that we as the therapists don't need to dangle a proverbial carrot the whole time of, okay, well, is that a toward move for you? Like, is that moving you towards your values? Oh, is that helping? Instead, we get to just really be curious and ask, like, okay, so where is this at with your values? Like, you told me that you're going back to school full time on Tuesday, and you spent the whole weekend in bed by yourself watching Netflix, ordering, artisan delivery pizza on Uber Eats, right? What was that about for you? Oh, Tim, I was totally like in avoidance mode. I'm like feeling so overwhelmed about going to school on Tuesday. Okay, yeah. And did that work? Was it a problem? No, it wasn't. Because like, all right, I had my down weekend. I had my indulgence. Okay, Tim, it's time for me to go all in, Timmy boy. Here I go. I'm going to class on Tuesday, right? Like, I mean, it allows us to have some flexibility when it comes to things like avoidance and control strategies, where we don't need to just judge it all as bad. There's no such thing as maladaptive. There's only adaptive behavior.
How, well, let me rephrase the question. There are a lot of listeners to this podcast who are kind of starting out on their trauma-informed journey, if you will. Some in school, some just getting out of school, some more seasoned yet who want to learn about trauma. You think this would be good for them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The ACT approach, and we call it an approach because it's not this manualized, you need to do this in this order, right? It's an approach. So you get to custom tailor it. I think this is a really fantastic, I wish I had heard of this earlier, and that somebody had to put, this book in my hands, because it's going to empower you to do your work creatively, to do your work in a way that's based relevantly on what works for the client, not what ought to work or abstractly, has worked in this isolated randomized control trial. No. We're sharing processes with you. You custom fit it. You use the process measures. You grind it with your clients. And I also want to say this. Regardless of whether you buy this book, you already are on an incredible journey of self-discovery, because you're listening. You're taking the time out of your day to do this. Like, you're my people. Mm-hmm. Guy, this tribe that you've created, this is cool. Like, these are people who care. So your values match my own. So regardless of, whether or not you feel like purchasing an ACT book or not, if you could just take a word of like acceptance is a legitimate alternative to control, and you could like work on that in your practice, look for your clients' values in their darkest moments, know that what is connected to what matters to them is also what hurts most, help them to be engaged in the moment, you're doing some really good empirically supported ACT work there, I'd say.
Wow. I want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Timothy Gordon. The book is The ACT Approach, a comprehensive guide for acceptance and commitment therapy. Trauma Therapist podcast listeners can head on over to www.pesi.com/Gordon, that's Gordon, and enter promo code TTP20 for 20% off. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page. Tim, dude, you are awesome. And I mean that sincerely.
Guy.
From the moment we started the emailing back and forth, I was like, where's this guy been? He's should have been on the.
I've been on your mailing list, homeboy. I've been right there.
But sincerely, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I went through this book and I was like, this is for me. This whole idea of, acceptance instead of control, that speaks to me, for better or worse.
Hey, we got the data to support it. Guy, just as a way of saying goodbye, I want to tell you, because I don't know if you get to hear it very often. What you're doing is really special. You're an incredible person. Thank you for creating a community for people who are interested in doing this really good work, to have these conversations. You matter, your listeners. Man, I feel really honored to be a part of this tribe. This is cool.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, man. We'll be in touch.
For sure. Take care.